I recognize some faces here already. We're so glad to see you here today. And it's a real privilege to be here with David Sаттera as our guest. David, I think a couple of you were at his lecture yesterday. And so those who were there know a bit about him, but I will just repeat briefly. David has been a commentator, an analyst, a correspondent for some of the leading journalistic enterprises of the world, including Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal. He's written about the beat, the area that will be yours in the future. He's written throughout his career about this part of the world as a correspondent, as an analyst, as an author. Back home in Denver, Colorado, I have a book of yours, David, on my bookshelf called, it was a long time ago and it never really happened, which can be kind of a puzzling title, but it's an intriguing title because it suggests that we need to look backward on the period specifically that David covered as a correspondent in Moscow to understand well what is going on today, both in terms of the states that once comprised the Soviet Union, and in terms of the way the outside world understands what's going on in these countries. I'm hopeful that today we can hear David reflect on his time as a journalist, as a correspondent, as an author, and then also offer, in response to your questions, some advice on how to cover this difficult environment today. So with that, I mean, I've told David that you are the future of Ukrainian journalism, and I believe that to be true. So much in the future depends on the work that you do. So I'm really hopeful that you will take an active part in this discussion with David about his experiences and his books, and why, looking back, you do really have to understand what really happened. So David, with that, if I could invite you to sort of set the scene for us. I've maybe missed a couple of pieces of your biography, so please add them for our benefit. And feel free to walk about and treat the room as your auditorium. Thank you, David.
Thank you, and thanks to all of you for coming. And as I look at you all, I realize that probably every one of you, I don't think there are too many exceptions, were born after the Soviet Union fell. And that's very, very important because actually I want to, better to look at you and also to kind of talk to you. The Soviet Union was a very important experience, and you know, when I was your age, I was once, and there was nothing more important in the world than the Soviet Union. For Americans, the Soviet Union was the great danger, the great threat to the United States, a country that was capable of bombing us with nuclear weapons. When I was a boy, we had air raid drills in which the kids all hid under their desks because, or lined up in the corridors in case of an atomic attack on the United States. And all of the kids wondered, well, how would they be separated from their parents? How would they find their parents under conditions in which the Soviet Union was bombing us with nuclear bombs? And in 1962, when I was, actually I was 15, there was the Cuban Missile Crisis, in which I remember night after night, the television was showing the meetings of the United Nations Security Council as people feared that we were on the brink of nuclear war, because the United States imposed a quarantine over Cuba and said they would stop any ship trying to bring missiles into Cuba. And the crisis passed when Khrushchev ordered the Russian ship, or Soviet ships, to turn around and not to challenge the blockade. After that, of course, there was the war in Vietnam, in which the Soviet Union backed the North Vietnamese, and the United States tried to support the government of South Vietnam. And that divided the United States. It was a massive protest movement in the US against the war in Vietnam. By that time, I was a student at Oxford University. And like many students of that period, I was just your age. I was maybe your age or a little younger. And we were all against the war in Vietnam, didn't want any part of it, thought it was unjust and immoral, in part because we didn't know that much about communism. And it wasn't clear to us what was at stake in the war. But the point is that the Soviet Union was something that we all grew up with. One way or another, it was a country which existed as an alternative to everything that we knew. It was threatening, but it was also, for a certain number of people, very interesting, because the Soviets were claiming to build a perfect society, and we knew that our society was not perfect. So we asked ourselves, is it really possible that those people in places like Moscow and Kyiv and Lvov were living in paradise? It didn't seem likely, but that's what they claimed. I began traveling in the early 1970s. Actually, in 1969, I made my first visit to Kyiv and walked up and down the Khreshchatyk. Of course, I didn't know anyone in Kyiv in those days. And I went to one of the in-tourist restaurants, and I remember I was introduced to Chicken Kyiv, and the orchestra, I remember, was playing, to my surprise, Hava Nagila, which is, but I came back repeatedly while I was a student at Oxford, and I was so fascinated by the Soviet Union that I returned to the Russian language. I'd begun studying it when I was a high school student. I grew up in Chicago, and in Chicago, there was one high school near the University of Chicago. The University of Chicago is one of the best universities in America, and a Russian woman, an emigre woman, lived in the neighborhood and was offering a Russian course for high school students. This was very, very unusual. But I had a choice in the school of Russian, German, Spanish, French, or Latin, and I thought that of all those languages, Russian might be the most interesting. And I asked my father about it, and he said, you know, if you can speak Russian, it would make a huge difference. But of course, I said, as far as I know, Americans cannot go to live in the Soviet Union. There's just a small number of diplomats and journalists who are permitted to go there. I could not have imagined at that time, at the age of 12 or 13, that one day I would be one of them. But that's what happened, because when I was at Oxford, I began, even though I didn't study Russian, I studied political philosophy, I began to take Russian courses at the local teachers' college, and to help me when I went to the Soviet Union as a visitor. In those days, Kyiv was completely Russian-speaking. If the Ukrainian language was used at all, it was used by, very simple people when they were talking to each other. For example, the women who cleaned up in the hotel, or the dejurnaya, the word dejurnaya, the superintendents on the hotel floors. Every floor had someone to keep an eye on what was going on, and especially in the hotels where foreigners were living. And they occasionally spoke Ukrainian, but I was told that Ukrainian is just for the countryside, that the language is Russian. And the impression that was created in 1969 in Kyiv was that this is just a Russian city, or a typical Soviet city, not different from others. But by learning Russian at that time, and by going to the Soviet Union, I developed the idea that I would like to go to Moscow as a correspondent. And I got a job after Oxford as a reporter on the Chicago Tribune, which I'm from Chicago, and I worked at night covering police and anything else that happens at night in Chicago, for the most part, murder and mayhem. And I went, at the same time, however, I had not finished my Oxford thesis. I left Oxford without finishing it. So during the day I worked on my thesis. At night I was reporting in Chicago and covering police. And I finally finished the thesis and went back to Oxford to defend my thesis, which was on the social and political thought of Hannah Arendt, who's a theorist of totalitarianism, including the Soviet system. And my thesis supervisor introduced me, or set up an appointment for me with his friend, the managing editor of the London Financial Times. And I went to see him, and the first question that he asked me is, "Where would you like to go?" I was completely amazed by this question, because he didn't know anything about me. And he hadn't hired me, he hadn't offered me a job. And he was asking me where I wanted to go. So he said, "Well, do you know any foreign languages?" I said, "Well, I know Russian." He goes, "Oh boy." Was it? How I got the nerve to say that, I don't know. Because what I meant was I would like to know it. And he said, "Well, we'll send you to Moscow." And then he said, "Excuse me, but I'm very busy. I have to leave. I'll be in Chicago in 6 weeks and we'll finalize everything." And I was completely astounded by this. And I said to him, "Well, wouldn't you like to see something I've written?" And he looked at me in this way, as if this kind of a puzzled look came over his face. He said, "Yeah, send me something." And that was it. I was hired at age 28 to be the Moscow correspondent of the Financial Times. I was the youngest correspondent in Moscow. And when I came there, I remember one of the doormen said, I'll tell you in Russian, everybody understands Russian, I suppose, don't we, more or less? Said, "Такой молодой человек и такая солидная газета." And the Russians all referred to me as Agurchik. You know what Agurchik is? You know what it's from Agurets. You know what? It's cucumber, like green. And Zinaida Grigorenko, you know who General Grigorenko was, don't you? You know, Ukrainian dissident. I met them. He was put in a mental hospital because he protested the invasion of Czechoslovakia. Grigorenko, she said, do you see what kind of silly and unserious people they send here? She said about me. That she thought this is her first impression, I was silly and not very serious. But later she changed her mind. Later she changed her mind, as did everybody else. But that was the first impression. But that's how I got to the Soviet Union. And that was, I arrived there, I was 28 years old. As I said, the other correspondents were older, but not necessarily better, because in many cases, those who were sent to Moscow did not want to be there. They considered, they referred, you know, in New York is referred to as the Big Apple, and they referred to Moscow as the Big Potato, because it was uninteresting, not very attractive, not amusing, and not a place that anyone would want to stay. It was normal for American newspapers to send correspondents to Moscow for 2 years, maybe 3 at the most, usually 2, in order, and without any knowledge of the Russian language, and with no interest in Soviet history, and just in order that they would, do the job and get out and leave, and then come back to Washington or London or Paris and move and enjoy a promotion. Without the Russian language, they were dependent on the Soviet staff. The Soviet staff was provided by the KGB. They lived in buildings that were provided by an organization called Uperga, which was Upravlение обслуживания дипломатического корпуса, famous organization, to which the foreigners had to turn to fulfill all requests, whether it was train tickets, concert tickets, repair of an apartment, the ability to change an apartment, the ability to hire a new secretary or driver. Secretaries and drivers and maids all worked for the KGB. The apartments all had microphones, and not just microphones, but also cameras. I know this because I met, after the Soviet Union fell, I met one of the KGB agents who was responsible for monitoring what was going on in my building, including me. And we talked about it afterward. I'll come to that later. But under these conditions, most of the Americans were very uncomfortable. Their phones were tapped so that they couldn't really feel free when they were on the phone. And in addition to everything else, there was nothing to buy in the stores. And to get anything, you had to stand in long lines with these broken down people who didn't know how to dress, didn't have access to cosmetics, and in general were speaking this incomprehensible language. It was just torture. There were stores, special stores for foreigners, but compared to a Western supermarket, a Berioska store is a joke. And the most difficult thing is that the Western correspondents in most cases were married. And they had wives. And if the correspondents suffered, the wives suffered twice as much, because there was nothing for them to do except to aggravate their husbands. And so what tended to happen was the even if a journalist took an interest in what was going on, his wife would bring great pressure on him to leave Moscow as soon as possible. Against this background, I was an exception. First of all, I was single. I was young, and I was determined to learn the language, which is not easy, by the way, especially for an English speaker. I had all of the journalists had Russian teachers, who, by the way, all worked for the KGB and all were politically orthodox. But I had one as well. They found it very, very difficult to go to their lessons. Any kind of excuse, a cocktail party, a dinner at the home of diplomats, anything at all was an excuse for canceling Russian lessons. But I was religious. I not only went to all my lessons 3 times a week, no matter what, but every time I heard a word I didn't understand, I wrote it down in a notebook that I carried with me at all times. I really wanted to learn to speak the language. And we began with Master and Margarita, and by the time, after 2 years, we had gotten to the end of the novel, I could already work in Russian. And I no longer was part of the foreigner's world in Russia. For many of the journalists, the job consisted of receiving information in English from TASS, from the TASS newswire that was translated. The Russian newspapers were translated. The journalists read the TASS newswire. If they saw something interesting, they called a diplomat in the American embassy, who also probably didn't speak very good Russian, but who had official contacts with Russian officials or Soviet officials, and he would get some comments, and so the article would read, the Soviet news agency TASS said that the Soviet Union will not look kindly on American activities in the Middle East if they do X, Y, and Z. Who knows what it is? So the journalists would then call the diplomats at the embassy and say, and ask, well, what does this mean? And the diplomat would say, well, they've said this in the past, they said this in the future, they are likely to say this in the future. It probably means that their position is the same as it's always been, or something like that. And then they would sit down and write in a story saying that the Soviet Union is looking very carefully at American policy in the Middle East, or some such thing. But it was based on diplomatic sources, on official, the reporting was based on official Russian information that was presented by the Russian government, and there was no real contact in many cases with Soviet society, with the people who actually lived here, with your parents, grandparents. And they were something of a mystery. The journalists could see the people on the street, of course, but the people generally took the subway, and we traveled everywhere in cars. So it was, the Soviet people were kind of an abstraction for many of the journalists. And the society was a mystery. Even though we lived there and worked, the journalists lived there and worked there. Now, the Soviet Foreign Ministry, and we use the words Russian and Soviet interchangeably, and that's why I still do it, would organize trips for the journalists. And they would take a trip to Uzbekistan, they would take a trip to Soviet Ukraine, Soviet Estonia, they always put the word Soviet in front of it. And I remember in one of the first trips that I went on with them, we went to Uzbekistan, and some Uzbek officials were talking about the aid that came from all of the fraternal Soviet republics to Uzbekistan after the earthquake that destroyed part of Tashkent. And they said they said that, you know, this is the genius of the Soviet system. And a Soviet journalist who was with us raised his hand and said to these Uzbek officials, how do you explain the success of Soviet Uzbekistan? And the three officials said in chorus, all with one voice, friendship of peoples. So later on, this friendship of peoples, you know, returned in all the republics, including in Chechnya. At that time, there was a Chechen-Ingush autonomous Soviet republic. Later, when I was talking about the Chechen War with some Chechens, they recalled that there was a statue in Grozny of a Chechen, an Ingush, and a Russian with their arms around each other, which had, of course, the title Friendship of Peoples, and which the Chechens referred to as Three Fools. And that was really the spirit of the trips that the journalists took. They would go to a collective farm where that had been visited, that was specially organized for them, and that had been visited by journalists so many times that the collective farmers, including the dairymaids who milked the cows, became international celebrities. And when the New York Times went up to a dairymaid and asked her if he could interview her, she said, "No, I'm talking now to Le Monde and Süddeutsche Zeitung. I don't have time for you." Because and the same was true in factories and other specific sites that were organized for the journalists. And year after year, the journalists would go, speaking no Russian, and with their KGB interpreters, to collective farms and factories that were organized specifically to give them a false impression. And they would come back and write stories about the new Soviet factory for doing X, Y, or Z and the progress it was making, and so on and so forth. So, in summary, the journalists, for the most part, without the language, without the background, and without the history, and most of all, without the desire to understand what was happening, entered almost completely into the imaginary world of the Soviet Union. And of course, the picture that they reported back to the West was not an accurate picture, was not a true picture. Well, what I wanted to do was I wanted to leave behind the world of the foreigners and the official Soviets. Now, there were dissidents at this time, and the journalists did go to the dissident press conferences, including the press conferences at the apartment of Andrei Sakharov. Now, I hope everyone has heard of Sakharov. Is there anybody who hasn't? No? Well, I mean, you know, he was the human rights leader in the Soviet Union. And I knew him quite well. And they would report on these press conferences. But here again, you know, they would report the facts, but not the significance. And I was interested in the significance. And I left behind the world of the English-speaking press corps and began to meet Russians. It was easier, of course, for me because I was single and I could move easily in the society. But most of all, by the time I had been there for 2 years, I was speaking Russian very fluently. And I could work in Russian, I could interview in Russian. And I understood everything that was being said to me. And it was at that time that I came to Ukraine with my mother and my sister, because I'm also from Ukraine. or at least my ancestors were. They were from, of all places, Chernobyl, before Chernobyl became famous. And then my grandparents lived in Kyiv and emigrated to the United States in 1913, before the First World War. And had they, I mean, it's a tragic thing because I'm Jewish, and my mother was one of 5 sisters. Had they not emigrated, they would have all ended up at Babi Yar. And instead, of course, they came to the United States and lived peacefully and for the most part, happily. One relative stayed behind in Chernobyl. And I was correspondent in Moscow, and my mother and sister and I went to Chernobyl to visit the town and to try to find out some information about our uncle. It turned out that he had been evacuated. He was an old man, but he was evacuated during the war, and he came back and he survived the Second World War. But because of the Stalinist terror, he stopped writing letters because it was dangerous to write to your relatives in those years. And this was the occasion of my first appearance in the Ukrainian press, because the local officials in Chernobyl tried to force us to leave, before we had actually talked to people and seen the town, and I refused to leave the town. And so Ukrainskaya Pravda wrote an article about me in which I was accused of being, they said I was a hooligan, that I behaved like a hooligan unleashed. And they said that I demonstrated what they called barskaya povedenia in relation to the officials. And then that was used as the basis to try to expel me from the Soviet Union in 1979 on the grounds of hooliganism. But I, at that time, was an American citizen working for the Financial Times, and the Russian authorities, or Soviet authorities, assumed that neither the Americans nor the British would defend me. But both of them did, and they both threatened to expel Soviet correspondents. So they were in danger of losing 2 correspondents in return for expelling me. And they allowed me to stay. And at that point, I began collecting material for a book. And that book is this one, which is now in Ukrainian. It's called The Age of Delirium, that I began in 1979. And I learned something that I now recommend to you as journalism students, that the story is always deeper than the actual event. And the event is interesting, but what lies behind the event is what really matters. And I began traveling all over the Soviet Union and getting people to tell me their stories. And I began to talk to the dissidents, and the dissidents were just transmitting information that they received from inside the Soviet Union, people who had been victims of human rights abuses. And I asked them to put me in touch with the victims themselves. Now, later today, we'll show you a segment from my film, which, by the way, is also in Ukrainian. It's in English and Russian as well, about my encounter with one of the victims in Donetsk. But I began and I was particularly interested in the victims of psychiatric repression. Because as a result of my studies at Oxford, I understood that the Soviet system and all totalitarian systems are basically an effort to impose a false version of reality on an entire population by force. And so I was aware of the fictitious nature, the imaginary nature of the Soviet system. And I wanted to talk to the dissidents who dealt with psychiatric repression, because in a society that's based on a false version of reality, it would be normal people who would be put in mental hospitals. Whereas in a normal society, it's people who have a deranged view of reality who are put in mental hospitals. And so it was. And I met many people from Ukraine, actually, who were victims of psychiatric repression. And one of the centers of psychiatric repression was the Dnepropetrovsk Special Psychiatric Hospital, a famous place in the Soviet Union. And I began interviewing those people and telling their stories. And many of them later became the heroes of my book. And if any of you get the book and read it, you'll read those stories. And it was this experience that convinced me that the Soviet Union could not last forever. It was too artificial, too imaginary, and too dependent on force. To a certain extent, these characteristics prevail in present-day Russia, but we'll get to that in a minute. I worked on that book as I was reporting from the Soviet Union for the next 3 years. And I became very successful as a reporter because I was operating in a way that was different than the way in which the other reporters were operating. I chose reporting on the events as my secondary occupation. My primary occupation was to learn about the society. But with having inverted the normal order of activities, I found that I learned much more in the way of events, of facts about what was going on in the society, than if I had simply looked for whatever was being reported in the news. And I was able to report one exclusive story after another. For example, I reported about the trial of officials in the ministry of Rybnaya Khazyastva, fishing ministry, who had been taking had been smuggling caviar out of the country in cans that were marked as preserved sausage or something, but it was a real conspiracy to smuggle out caviar and be paid in hard currency. I reported on the strikes that had broken out in Togliatti, where the big auto factory was, and in Kamaz. And oftentimes, dealing with people was not easy, because I had to try to understand, since this was all information that could not be confirmed officially, I had to be able to trust my sources of information. I had to be able to feel whether they were telling me the truth or not. I remember when there was a report of a strike at the Putilov tractor factory in Leningrad, which was one of the factories that was active in the Russian Revolution, had a big role, the Putilov factory. And I was at a meeting of dissidents. There was a group in Moscow called the Committee to Defend the Rights of Invalids. And there were people there who had lost their legs, their arms, or for whatever reason, were confined to wheelchairs because they had suffered traumatic injuries. And I asked one girl from Leningrad if she knew anything about what happened in the Putila factory. And at first she said, yes, it's true. And then she looked at, I said, can you, I tried to question her. And her face became absolutely frozen with fear. And she said, no, I can't tell you anything else. I don't want to end up an invalid. So it was, then there was, I got information about the leak at a bacteriological weapons factory in Sverdlovsk, where somebody named Boris Єльцин was the party boss. And people were dying in Sverdlovsk because the bacteriological weapon that was being produced in the factory had escaped, and it was killing people. And I called up the newspaper in Sverdlovsk. In those days, it was just unthinkable for a Western correspondent to get the telephone number of a Soviet newspaper in a town which is closed to foreigners, by the way. Foreigners did not have the right to travel to Sverdlovsk in those days, and start asking them questions. But I did it. I said, well, this is, what's this, why did you, I had been told that the local newspaper had published an article, what is Sibirskaya Yazva? You know what that is in English? It's anthrax. That's a bacteriological weapon. And the local newspaper, Вечерний Sverdlovsk, ran an article, what is Sibirskaya Yazva? Because there was panic in Sverdlovsk, and they were trying to say that, don't worry, this is from contaminated meat, not from a leak in a bacteriological weapons factory. And I said, well, I called someone at the newspaper. A woman picked up, and I asked her, I said, when did you run the article about Sibirskaya Yazva? And she stupidly said, oh, that was just to give, it was just a routine warning to people. It didn't have any significance. But she had confirmed for me that the article had appeared. And that was enough corroboration to write an article saying that there was a bacteriological weapons leak in Sverdlovsk. So the point is that by going out into the society and by talking to people and developing contacts outside of the diplomatic world, outside of the world of the English-speaking correspondence, you've suddenly found out all kinds of things. And even though I was not necessarily trying to succeed as a reporter in those days, at that point I wanted to write books. And I saw my mission more in terms of writing, something broader than just a newspaper article. But in doing that, I automatically gained an enormous amount of material for my newspaper articles. And that was, it was as a result of that I was relatively successful as a journalist in Moscow. And I left in 1982, but this time the Soviets were not going to let me back in. And I was not able to get back in any real sense until 1990. I was the last journalist to be allowed back into the Soviet Union during the period of Perestroika. And interestingly, I was the first to be expelled in 2013. So I established 2 records. And in those years, I began that I was not going to Russia, not going to the Soviet Union. I worked on on the book that we now have in front of us that's the basis of the movie. But the situation changed and the Soviet Union collapsed. Now, the Soviet Union collapsed because of developments inside the Soviet Union that no one could really have expected. Gorbachev, for reasons of his own, began to introduce truthful information. For the first time, it was possible in the Soviet Union to read many truthful facts about the country's history and about tragic events, including, in the case of Ukraine, the Golodomor. And the result was basically to destroy the basis of the Soviet system. Because the Soviet system was a lie integrated into an entire way of life. I mean, if we talk about various countries, talk about Russia, Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, many other countries, these are historic nations. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. These are historic nations, but the Soviet Union was not a nation, it wasn't a culture. It was a collection of nations based on socialism, which is based on Marxism-Leninism, which is an ideology, which is based on a lie. And when that lie began to be exposed, there was nothing to hold the Soviet Union together. And that's one of the reasons why the Soviet Union broke up into 15 separate republics. But a country that's based on lies also has an effect on the integrity and character of the people who live in it. And it became obligatory in the Soviet Union to live according to the lie, to act as if the lie were the truth, and to behave in all situations, in public at least, as if everything that was stated in the ideology was the truth. And remember, in the Soviet Union, and this applies to Ukraine as well, every part of the Soviet Union, every enterprise, every office, every collective farm, every factory was organized as a collective, and in each collective there was a Communist Party organization, and the Communist Party organization was responsible for ideological conformity. So that the people in the collective, first of all the people in the party, but then the people in the collective were responsible for showing their support for the ideology of the party. And it was taken for granted that that only a crazy person who belonged in a mental hospital or a dissident who was working for the West would object to the wonders of the Soviet system. And I had a friend, and I spoke about this yesterday, who was a reporter for Moskovskaya Pravda, and he told me how he worked. He said that Brezhnev would make a speech, and he would call the director of a factory and say, Brett, did you hear Brezhnev's speech yesterday? He said, what do the workers think of Brezhnev's speech? And he would say, the workers approve of Brezhnev's speech. I said, can you give me the names of some workers? So he would give him 3 or 4 names, and he would write an article, inventing comments for each worker, saying how much they liked Brezhnev's speech. The next day, the workers would open Moskovskaya Pravda and read their remarks. But of course, no one ever talked to them. But that was the attitude of the regime toward the people, that they didn't have opinions of their own. Their opinion was whatever the authorities said it was. Well, that came to an end with perestroika and with glasnost. And it was this that led to the breakup of the system. Because the imaginary, this kind of imaginary world actually had a hypnotic effect. It was like hypnotism, because even though each person thought differently for himself, when everyone was together, for example, in a meeting like this, everyone agreed. And if you see that you're in a meeting in which everyone is voting yes, you have to privately ask yourself whether maybe they're right after all, or maybe I'm losing my mind. But the easiest thing to do was also to vote yes, and not to cause trouble and ruin your life. Well, the impact of an imaginary world was, and the impact of the obligation constantly to lie, was to split consciousness. In other words, people developed something that George Orwell, I mean, everyone has read 1984, I suppose, right? Yeah, you know it? That's the Soviet Union. It was, and Orwell had a concept called doublethink. And doublethink was the result of splitting consciousness, so that people thought in official terms when they had to, but reacted normally whenever they did not have to. Needless to say, this had an effect on morality, because if consciousness is split, the individual doesn't have the ability to stand up for any kind of moral principles. And this was consistent with the ideology too, because the Soviet Union was based on the idea that there's no such thing as universal morality. You know, the principle that's embodied in the Western tradition that do unto others as you would have them do unto you, that morality is universal. It applies equally to all people. The Soviet Union, whatever was understood that what was moral was whatever served the working class. The working class was the hegemonic class, or class hegemon, as they said in the Soviet Union. And therefore, anything that served the working class was right. And the Communist Party represented the working class. And the leadership of the Communist Party represented the Communist Party. And the leader of the Communist Party represented the leadership. So whatever the leader says was right, and anything else was wrong. Well, the impact of that was not, was to destroy people's sense of right and wrong. And that's the great problem in the post-communist world today. It's the problem in Russia, it's the problem in Ukraine, it's the problem everywhere. The people's sense of morality was destroyed. Yeah, I began to follow events in Russia. I began to travel to Russia, but I went to go, because Moscow was where I had always gone. And I wrote another book, which also exists in Ukrainian, called The Less You Know, the Better You Sleep. Mensch znaєш, крепче спиш. And in that book, I talked about what happened after the collapse of the imaginary world. The ideology was gone. I mean, Russia, Ukraine, they don't live anymore. These countries no longer live in a world of ideological fantasies. But the morality, the destruction of the morality which the imaginary world created or induced is still a huge problem in both countries. In Russia, the so-called young reformers took the view that what mattered was to transform the economic system. Not transform the consciousness of people, not establish morality or the rule of law, but transform the economic structures. But the core problem was not the economy, even though the economy under socialism is extremely inefficient. The core problem was the moral damage that was done. And under these circumstances, the result in Russia was that communism was abolished, socialism was abolished, but the country was taken over by criminals. To a certain extent, the wealth was seized by a few people called oligarchs. The country was driven into poverty. to a certain extent, the same thing happened in Ukraine. And with the exception that in Russia, a process began of turning the country into an authoritarian dictatorship, which in many respects resembled the Soviet Union. In October 1993, Yeltsin shelled the parliament building with tanks in order to destroy the parliament. Fortunately, nothing like that happened here in Ukraine. That was the first step toward the ascension of Putin. Yeltsin became very, very unpopular. And there was a reason for that. It was because of the poverty. I traveled to, I'll just give you one example. But I could give you lots of examples, but I went to Vladivostok, which by the way has a big Ukrainian population. And there was ice on the Gulf of, what's it called? Gulf of, I think it's not the Gulf of Vladivostok. Anyway, it's the body of water, that's right along, that it's the bay of something.
The Golden Horn.
It's, yeah, I'll check a map anyway, forgive me, I've forgotten that name, but it freezes over in the winter time. And the people go out on the ice to fish, but the ice is unreliable and it constantly breaks and people fall into the water and drown in the water. And there are signs everywhere saying, don't go on the ice, because then the Coast Guard has to go out and rescue those people. And there was one incident in Vladivostok in which about 6 or 7 people fell into the ice broke, and 6 or 7 people were drowned. The next day, the ice is full of people fishing in the same place where the drownings had taken place. And the police went and the Coast Guard went, and they chased them off, except for one old man who was way out on the edge of the ice. And they shouted at him and from loudspeakers. Finally, they got him and they brought him into shore. And the journalist asked him, he said, why do you go out there on the ice like that? You know what could happen. Well, you know what happened yesterday. And he said, it's better to die than to live the way I'm living now. And against that background, the death rate in Russia, and the death rate here too, by the way, was so high that the demographers could not believe the figures. And so who was going to vote for Yeltsin under those conditions? His support was 2%. And he was totally corrupt. And at that point, the apartment buildings in Russia began to be blown up. 300 people were killed, and they were blown up buildings were blown up in the middle of the night. A bomb was discovered in the basement of a 5th building in the city of Ryazan, and it was a live bomb. And at that point, a manhunt began in the city. The whole city was cordoned off, and 3 people were arrested. And they turned out not to be terrorists, but actually agents of the FSB, the Federal Security Service. So they bombed those buildings deliberately to create panic, to create an excuse for a new war, and to create the conditions for Putin to win an election he would have never won anyway, and then to protect Yeltsin. Well, I went to Ryazan in April 2000 and interviewed, while it was still possible, the people in the building and the police, and it was obvious to me that this was a provocation, that they intended to blow up the building. And the building was built on a hill on very unstable ground. If it had been blown up, it would have hit the next building, neighboring building with the force of an avalanche. And it would have carried that one with it. And there would have been 800 dead, 400 in each building. But the Russians had started the war in Chechnya regardless. They were already bombing Grozny, but they wanted those bombings in Ryazan to completely unite the Russian people behind the aggressive war. Well, to this day, the West and other countries, not so much Ukraine, but Western countries, refuse to recognize the truth, or to speak the truth about what happened in the apartment buildings. And the fact that Putin came to power through an act of terror. I insisted on doing that, and this is also part of the obligation of a journalist, because as journalists, basically the truth is our profession. And finally, the Russians, fortunately, decided that it was easier to tolerate me and pretend that what I was saying was just a conspiracy theory than to take some sort of action against me. But in 2013, the Maidan revolt occurred here in Ukraine. And the Putin regime became frightened. They saw that the Ukrainian public did something that the Russian public could also do. It organized itself spontaneously and independently to overthrow a kleptocratic regime. Their response was to take action. One action that they took was to expel me. It was almost what the Russians call первая ласточка. But beyond that, they took action against Ukraine, seizing Crimea and beginning the war in the Donbass, which is going on to this day. But in all situations that I've described throughout this period, the important thing for me, and I hope it'll be the important thing for all of you, is to be honest witnesses to what's going on, to look for the truth, and not to be afraid to communicate the truth. And that's oftentimes not easy, and it can involve risk, but it's the fundamental responsibility that we all have in the profession. Now, I'm grateful for my experiences in the Soviet Union, in Russia, and in Ukraine, and I continue to have those experiences. I can't go to Russia, but I can come here, thankfully. And I'm tied to both places. I can't cross the border into Russia, but I'm constantly being interviewed by the Russian media, and I'm in contact with Russia, almost as if I was there, so they can't get rid of me so easily. In fact, I talked about the injustice of it all on Russia in the Russian media, the American-supported Black Radio Liberty. I said, here you have a collection of thieves, murderers, and crooks who can care nothing about their country, and nobody expels them. I lived all these years in Russia. I never took a bribe, never committed a crime, and never did anything that was contrary to the interest of people. And I'm the one who's being expelled. So I said it should be the other way around, and maybe one day it will. So that's all I can tell you about journalism, Russia, Ukraine. Now the rest of it, now it's up to you guys to do to defend your country and the world, and I hope you all will. Go, yes, please.
Can we ask you questions?
You can, absolutely. But before we do that, I wonder if do you want to see a little short segment from the movie? Okay. Now this, I'll just explain which part of there were all, there are lots of stories here. The movie's based on the book, and I had to choose one story, so I'm choosing the story from the Donbass. There are other stories in the movie, and I encourage you to go to YouTube. The film is in Ukrainian, Russian, and English, so you can decide what language to listen in. So you all speak good English, you might want to watch it in English. The hero of this segment is named Alexei Nikitin, and I met him through a dissident who was part of the committee to defend the victims of psychiatric repression. And I met him and he told me his story, and this is what happened. And I also tell his story in the book. So why don't we start with that? I'll sit here as well.
Георгій Васильович,
Я думаю, погляди Георгія Васильовича співпадали з поглядами влад.
We should start with 30 minutes. 30, wait. Yeah, okay. It's just. No, earlier. It's still. Okay, wait. Yeah, okay, now. Yeah.
Студенти мене навіть і не бачили. Я зупинив машину. Якщо я не був з дисидентами, то з ким же я був? Спитав я їх. З естонським КГБ, сказав литовець. Але який в цьому сенс? СРСР – це край дивних речей, пояснив він. І час від часу КГБ любить створювати реальність.
There was a story in Age of Delirium that I felt had a special meaning.
Одна історія у віку безумства мала особливе значення для Девіда, мабуть, через драму, безпосереднім свідком якої він став у Донецьку, в Україні. Він сказав мені, що все в порядку, з кожної ситуації є вихід. Я пам'ятаю, я встав, підійшов до вікна, визирнув і побачив агентів КГБ, які сиділи в машинах і стояли навколо, оточивши нас, як вовки. Я зрозумів, що з деяких ситуацій виходу немає. Людиною, яку я ніколи не забуду, був Олексій Нікітин. Я приїхав, щоб послухати його історію про умови праці радянських шахтарів. Він працював на шахті Бутовка Донецька і попереджав, що там є небезпека вибуху. Якийсь час керівництво мирилося з його критикою, але у червні 69-го він організував страйк робітників, протестуючи проти несплати преміальних. І його звільнили. Він уже працював в колгоспі, коли в шахті пролунав вибух. Пророцтво Нікітина справдилося, і для нього це означало негайний арешт. Його привезли до місця, схожого на тюрму. Двері камери відчинилися, і він побачив десь 30 чоловіків з жовтими обличчями і дивно покрученими кінцівками. Він зрозумів, що це не в'язниця. Це була психіатрична лікарня. Ставте питання про умови праці, про оплату, про те, чи робітники всім задоволені. Це настільки нормально у західному розумінні. Тож, коли я приїхав до нього і ходив з ним, спочатку я не розумів, на яку небезпеку я наражаю його. І лише з розвитком подій я усвідомив те, що абсолютно нормально на Заході, було смертельно небезпечно в СРСР. Того вечора я визирнув з вікна і побачив машини біля під'їзду, купу агентів КГБ. І раптом він сказав: «Поїхали до Москви, завези мене до посольства США у Москві». Я не був готовий до такого, я завагався. Я сказав: «Ну, в посольстві ти будеш наче в'язень, тобі не дозволять виїхати з країни». А він сказав: «Це краще, ніж мене закатують до смерті у психушці».
Вы помните Алексея Никитина? Помните? Он был шахтер, он был арестован.
Да.
Да, это, конечно.
КГБ его преследовало.
Да.
Да.
И
Я
он-
был такой.
Что?
Был.
Я познакомился с ним в Москве. Он пригласил меня сюда, чтобы познакомиться с условиями работы шахтера. Вы не скажете, здесь есть люди, которые хорошо семью Никитина знал?
Есть.
Мы не можем найти.
А
мы
вот
не-
подойдите, бабушка у себя.
Меня зовут Андрей Некрасов.
Очень приятно. Я бабушка Катя. Так, что вас
Это
интересует?
Дэвид.
Меня зовут Дэвид, бабушка Катя.
Какая у нас?
Бабушка Марта. Так, что вас интересует?
Скажите мне, вы помните Алексея Васильевича Никитина?
Ну, я ее знала, а как я ничего в эти дела не вникала.
А, ну так, а кто вникал? Это что, сидели бабки?
Сидела ночью, как вот это сторожили, как его, это, ловить собираются, больше ничего.
Ночью? Ночью, да?
Ну, с вечера уже темно было.
Вы видели, как сторожили?
Ну, как и тут стояли люди, и там стояли, и там стояли. По-моему, так.
Його вели отак під руки. От, і він йшов. Ну, тільки чорний жакет на голові накиданий. І все, а так, він тут нікому плохого не делал. Ніхто за його нічого не говорив. Все було хорошо. А там хто його знає, що там получилось. То таке, то навіть знаєте, яке время було.
Таких людей уже не будет, как Алексей. Это человек, который добивался уважения к нам, людям, чтобы порядок был, дисциплина, как говорится, уважение было. Но он правды добивался. И вот за правду изгноило наше КГБ. Вот и самым прямым словом говорю, изгноило.
И вы помните, как КГБ окружал это здание, когда я приехал сюда?
Полностью на каждом углу стояли, волки стояли. По 4 человека в машине сидело. И плюс еще в коридорах стояли. По человеку, по 2 человека стояли. Чтобы в этот один. Даже и в этом один стоял.
А как можно одного человека вот так бояться? Он же безоружный. Он, да?
Понимаете?
Сколько же равно денег иметь?
КГБ не боялась пули. КГБ боялась языка, правда. Как-то Никитина забрали на дурдом, а потом он там пару месяцев находился на дурдоме, потом его перевели в нашу 21-ю больницу, как принято заболеванием. А мне, правда, говорил, это, говорит, заберут его, говорит, в дурдом, сделают с него дурака, переведут его, говорит, в нашу местную больницу, 21-ю, и там он умрет. И сбылись его слова, так оно и получилось. Правда, добивался и добился смерти.
Сказали нам, что вы его хорошо знали.
Ну, знал, я вместе работал.
Вы работали вместе?
Да. На каждом собрании выступает, все копается, все кого-то обвиняет и кидается. Главное то, что, ну, если где-то ты прав, так надо доказать правду.
Ну, я слышал, что он защищал рабочих. Знаете, условия работы, насколько я понимаю, в шахтах, были очень тяжелыми. И не просто тяжелыми, а техника безопасности, условия.
Там был взрыв.
Был взрыв, и он боролся за улучшение условий, гарантий безопасности. Это не так?
Значит, я вам скажу вот что. Условия эти были не только для него тяжелыми, были для меня и для остальных. Вот у нас 2000 человек работало, для всех одинаковые были условия.
Я так понял, что он боролся за права не только свои.
Так вот именно, что, понимаете, он за права, если он боролся, но для этого надо иметь прямые доказательства, прямые улики. Но вот эта болезнь, не зря он и попал в дурдом.
Но если он предупредил, скажем, что здесь нарушение правил и техники,
такого не было, чтобы он сказал.
И после этого был взрыв, и после взрыва он был помещен в психбольницу. Что это скажет?
Причина взрыва.
Ну, знаете, причина взрыва что? Вот. Мы сами видели, шахта сверхкатегорна, вот. Вот загазованность большая, вот. Глубина очень большая, вот. И пласты, они способны воспламеняться. Вот и взрывы получились.
У вас кто-нибудь погиб из друзей там?
Ну, я знаю, столько людей на шахте погибло. Я меньше сейчас живых знаю, чем мертвых. Поняли?
И друзья,
и родственники. А кто же? Мог могу и я попасть. Ну, так получилось, что случилось. Я с утра работал, а кто поехал ночью, понимаете, это же...
Могли бы и вот так.
Конечно, или вот лента, вот, транспортерная, оборвалась лента, 20 человек попало на похоронах, я думаю, все, некоторые говорили, брошу в шахту, это ну его. Прошло какой-то промежуток времени, все забылось, пошли и опять начали работать.
Все, что он сказал, много людей тоже знали и знали лучше, чем он.
Совершенно верно.
Значит, что все, что он сказал, это более-менее правда.
Много было, больше было такое, понимаете, вот, около правды.
Около правды.
Да, около правды. Иди сюда. Иди, слушай.
Хорошо.
Да.
I think that Georgy Vasilievich.
Я думаю, погляди Георгія Васильовича співпадали з поглядами влади, як і у багатьох людей в той час. Але в них не було іншого виходу. Той, хто намагався щось змінити, мав бути дещо ненормальним. Радянський Союз дуже успішно створив штучну реальність. І цю штучну реальність люди настільки приймали на віру, що вважали, той, хто логічно міркує, хто наводить логічні заперечення і поводить себе як вільна людина, має бути психічно хворим.
That's just a part of the movie that you can read the episode in the book if you get it, and that and a lot more. And that was in Donetsk. Yeah, what's your question?
My name is Ira. I'm also a first-year journalist.
What's your name?
Ira.
Ira.
Yeah. So my question is kind of personal. I hope you're comfortable talking about that. You're from States and you're coming to Soviet Union after like a lot of years of Cold War and stuff. How did you feel in there? This is the first question. Have you ever felt that you're not an outsider anymore in there and that people actually treat you in an okay way? And also the second one is more practical. How long did it take you to finally get the information that you need to? And have you ever been treated they're like a fool when you're doing your investigation?
Did I ever feel like
a fool when you're like asking a question and they're just trying to, they're not providing you enough information or whatever because you're American, you can't, know what they're talking about and stuff.
Yeah, okay. Is this working? Is this work? Yeah. Well, of course, it's always a problem to get information. You never know the society as well as someone who grew up in that society. And sometimes for Americans, the Soviet system was so fantastic that it was hard to believe what you were really hearing. But as a result, the more people you talk to, the more people you meet, the more experience you have, the more you understand the society, the more it begins to make sense and you learn how to evaluate information. I would say that once I was able to speak Russian fluently, and when I was able to just leave behind the world of the foreigners, I really felt at home in Moscow and the Soviet Union, and I didn't feel like an outsider anymore. But it took an effort. You have to make an effort, and most people did not want to make that effort, or maybe they could not. Maybe they worked in. For those who worked in the embassy, they had bureaucratic restraints that they could not escape. I was lucky. I was lucky in a lot of ways. First of all, I was an American working for a British newspaper. So I wasn't really making a career the way the other journalists were. You know, the other journalists were worried about what is their editor at the New York Times going to say, will they be promoted? You know, they had to worry about impressing someone in New York or Washington who didn't know very much. And they risked jeopardizing their career if they said things that their superior did not understand. Financial Times had completely different structure. I was left alone to do whatever I wanted. And I didn't worry about what anyone would think. And as a result, I was able to really operate freely. And as a result of, you know, at first, of course, many things seemed strange, but I became accustomed to things. And I was able, absolutely, to be part of the society.
So David, you were really able to do something that few other correspondents could do at that time in Moscow. Your editors were fairly understanding, it sounds like.
Yeah, very, very much so.
You didn't have to do sort of that, all of the run-of-the-mill type
Yeah.
reporting that was based on the press releases and the news releases necessarily.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I had to do the run-of-the-mill reporting, but once I was done with it, I could go on and do what I wanted to do. There were certain things I had to do. I had to make sure that but I became very proficient at doing it quickly. And once I put in the necessary 10 hours or so, I was free the rest of the time. When I had, for example, in the Financial Times, I had to report, 4 times a year the results of the harvest, or you know, if a company concluded a contract, I had to do that, and I did all that, but it didn't take long, and it didn't occupy me mentally very much. I just did what I had to do.
Do we have other questions?
Hello, my name is Oksana.
What's your name?
Oksana.
Oksana?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, so I have first of all, thank you for the lecture. It was really, really interesting. And I have 2 questions. First of all, you mentioned the stories that you met with a man who was your KGB agent, and who and you said that you will tell it later, and I'll be very glad
I
if
forgot.
you will tell. Yes, and my question is how you managed to travel in Soviet Union, write a book, spoke with people, and KGB was also with you, and how you deal with it. And next question, in that film, in that episode, one man said, look what our KGB made with him. And that our KGB, he said our KGB, and for me it's like he associated himself with KGB and with that system.
Where was this?
In that episode with, I don't remember who it was exactly, but he said our KGB. Spoken about.
The man with mustache.
Yeah, yes, I don't remember his name.
Man with the mustache, we just saw just now?
Yes, just now. And he said, look what our KGB made to him. It was something like that.
During which episode that was? Was that at the very beginning?
Yes.
Just before we began the episode with Nikita?
Mm-hmm. No?
It
was Nikita? Yeah. About Nikita?
Yeah.
But it was very beginning.
The guy who spoke after Babushkas, and he was like very pro-Nikitin. He was like, he's the great guy, he strikes.
Yes. Okay, yeah, but that was the way people spoke in those days.
And
everything was nash, because, everything was collective.
And
it was,
I'm interested about your point of view on that. is it real that people associated themselves with KGB, with that system? They thought that they are reality and they are part of that reality, or how it was?
Nash KGB. Yeah, it's more complicated, I think. This Nash, everything was Nash because, its idea is that we are all together, everything is together, all the property is together, we all live together, we all live the same. Then this habit this is I was on a train and we were going to Warsaw in Poland, and in Poland there's, in the center of Warsaw, the Soviets built a palace of culture, which was exactly kind of Stalin-era building, and some Soviet people on the train said, "That's a nasz padarak." So it's like from all of you wouldn't. But people were encouraged to say that the government, it's us. So when he said nasz KGB, it's just the way of speaking that people began to have, even if they didn't like the KGB. Dissidents would say that our KGB did this. It doesn't mean that they love the KGB, but it was, it began to be a kind of habit. I even began to use it a little bit sometimes when I was speaking to people.
And then there was...
So I would say, "Nasz sowieckie ludy, ani taki."
But and that and this encompassing ani that you would always encounter.
Yeah, and then there were чужой and ani. That's the американцы, британцы, французы, немцы, плохие, они все как это.
The first question was about KGB control.
How was I under? I forgot. Yes, this guy after the Soviet Union fell, I met him. How did I meet him? How was I remember and he was involved with some security company. I met the guy who was working in the Служба безопасности, the security service for Gazprom, because I was beginning to write my second book. My second book is called Darkness at Dawn: The Rise of the Russian Criminal State. And I wanted to talk to him about all these criminal gangs that had formed in Russia. And he introduced me to his friend who had been in the KGB and had been responsible for monitoring everything that went on in our building, including blackmailing people over sexual things and stuff like that. I could not be blackmailed because I didn't care. I was single, I was not married or anything. But other people it was different. And he told me all the fun he had, was from his point of view. But that was it. And he told me how the building was really under surveillance and they could hear and see everything inside.
And how you moved?
Okay.
Hi, my name is Yulia. And you have mentioned...
Yulia.
Yes, you have mentioned the book 1984.
Yeah.
And personally, I think that Russian authorities still use a lot of techniques described in that book, like double thinking and permanent state of military conflicts. And in your opinion, what techniques that are common for communist societies Russia uses today, if uses it all?
Well, propaganda. I mean, they are using the propaganda that is playing on people's emotions. I explained this yesterday, that for many people in the Soviet Union, but particularly in Russia, there was a feeling that yes, we live badly, that people in the West maybe have more than we do, but we are a great nation and the world is afraid of us. And then when the Soviet Union collapsed, people lost the sense, this gave a sense of meaning to their lives. Soviet Union collapsed and they lost that feeling. And as a result, now the Russian government is using war and propaganda to unite the population behind a corrupt leader. But the only reason they're able to do it is because of this nostalgia for the days when Russia was a great power, when the Soviet Union was a superpower, feared all over the world. This gives them a sense of status. So and the propaganda is able to use this very effectively in the case of many people. And also, historically, Russians in particularly, but Soviet people in general, they did not have the protection of the law. And if you don't have the protection of the law, you don't think in terms of your individual self-worth. And if you don't think in terms of your individual self-worth, then you gain your sense of worth from the prestige and power of the government or of the society. And that's what's happening right now in terms of Russian propaganda. They're trying to unite the people around a corrupt regime on the grounds that it is making, in a way, making Russia great again, to use the American. And how do they make it great again? Well, by attacking their neighbors, attacking Georgia, attacking Ukraine, by waging war in Chechnya, waging war in Syria.
Hi, thanks for your lecture. My name is Elzara, and you said the last actually the sentences that you said were about the duty of being the witnesses of the processes that happen now in Ukraine. And well, actually, I'm from Crimea, and my parents still live there, and that's why my question is really connected to the duty of journalists there. How can the people work there and investigate the problems? Because I know a lot of people who don't want to talk to journalists because they are very frightened of FSB coming to their houses afterwards. And exactly, it is also the problem for the journalist, even for his family also, that FSB will come to their places. And some of them are already sentenced, like Mykola Semena, who wrote about the blockade of Crimea. And that's why the question is how to be in the world of propaganda, to be the journalist and to give the truth to people and be safe. Is it a conflict or not now?
Yeah, well, in Crimea, it's definitely a conflict because they can arrest people on any kind of charges. We know what happened with Oleg Sentsov. I think that if worse comes to worse and you cannot safely publish the information yourself, you can try to transmit it to someone who can publish it, first of all. And if you can't do that for whatever reason, at least you gather the information for the future. That's what I would say in that situation. Because it's hard, everyone has to decide how much risk they are ready to take. And no one can make that decision for them. You cannot decide for another person what risks they will take as a journalist. But there are some alternatives if the situation is very dangerous. You can always try to give the information to a person who will not be as endangered as you would be, or in the final analysis, collect the information for the future, because the importance of the information will not disappear.
Давайте останнє питання.
Yeah. Okay. No, what?
Що там? Та ні, тоді... Ти передумав? Okay.
My name is Marta. Last year, during the PAN Congress, which took place in Lviv, one of the Russian writers claimed that the main problem of Russian liberal democracy is that people do not share a single meaning of what democracy is. Because for some people, democracy is associated with the free market in genes, and for some people, it is associated with the high criminal rate and instability in the country. I would like to know what is your opinion on this matter. Thank you.
Well, I think the big confusion is that many people in Russia don't understand that democracy is based on the rule of law, and that you cannot have democracy if you don't have law. And so this is what they organized something that they call democracy in Russia, but they didn't have any rule of law in the country. So the democracy was defective, and what it led to was criminality. I wrote about this in my second book, which unfortunately doesn't exist in Ukrainian, although it does exist in English and Russian. I think that if it was the ancient Greek philosophers identified the progression, flawed democracy leads to oligarchy, and oligarchy leads to tyranny. And this is what happened in Russia. And I think that if people understand that the basis of democracy is the rule of law, the confusion will disappear. Anybody else have any questions?
Maybe one more question, if there is one. Okay. Well, what we'd like to do is thank you, David, for your time. You've been very generous with it. Free flow of information, rule of law, courage to find the truth, provide the truth, communicate the truth. These are the sorts of values that we're trying to share, deepen, and you've helped us a great deal today. Thank you, David.
Thanks to all of you for coming.
We have a small present.
Oh, present? Oh my gosh.